Call the order, the August 15th, 2023 meeting at the Salem Planning Commission. Shelby, would you please call the roll?
Commissioner Augustine is absent. Commissioner Ekus. Commissioner Bott.
Here.
Commissioner Goebel is walking through the door. We'll come back to you. Commissioner Griggs.
Here.
Commissioner Heller. Commissioner Levin.
Here.
Commissioner Slater.
Here.
Commissioner Vieira Brandel is not here yet, and Commissioner Goebel.
Thank you.
We have
a quorum. Thank you. Moving to public comment for item 3. This is the time for anybody to comment if you like. Other than public hearings, deliberations, and merits of land use issues that are reviewable by us. So I'm not seeing anybody jumping out to the podium, so y'all are good. Moving on to the consent calendar, item 4.1. Since we're missing Commissioner Vieira Brandel and Commissioner Levin, would you please make that motion?
I can certainly do that. I will make a motion that we approve the draft minutes of the July 18th, 2023 Planning Commission hearing.
Thank you. Have a second? Second from Heller. Discussion on the motion.
I will be abstaining.
Thank you. Any other comments? Shelby, would you please call the roll, signify by saying aye if you're in favor of the motion, nay if you are opposed.
Commissioner Ekus.
I was absent. However, it appears that if all the people are absent didn't vote, we may not have.
There was 4 people absent from the last meeting, and then with Vieira Brandel.
Yeah, I'm trying to figure out if my vote is needed.
For
this motion.
You don't need quorum on the vote, so it just needs a simple majority. So
Okay.
you can abstain.
I will abstain.
Okay.
I wasn't.
Commissioner Bott.
Abstain.
Commissioner Goebel.
Approved.
Commissioner Griggs.
Aye.
Commissioner Heller.
Aye.
Commissioner Levin.
Abstain.
And Commissioner Slater is abstaining, and Commissioner Vieira Brandel is absent, and so is Commissioner Augustine.
So we don't have a majority.
It is, 4
Okay.
abstaining and 3 ayes.
That was never my forte. I was really excited for these majors. As evidenced in my counting. We'll move on to item 4.2. It's the code amendment resolution, the 23-02. Austin, do you want to give us a brief summary, or do you want to just two-liner?
Happy to.
Thank you.
So this code amendment is the result of some changes to state rulemaking. So the climate friendly and equitable communities rulemaking process has certain requirements. This code amendment applies to large parking lots, so those over half an acre in size, and it would propose some climate mitigation actions, either additional tree canopy coverage or solar power on site. And then it would also expand the opportunities for public bodies to convert existing parking lots to park and rides. And it would make some changes to allow single room occupancy housing more broadly in Salem, which is part of a different legislative process from the state,
Right.
also required.
And then Lisa reminded me that it will come before in a public hearing, either September, October-ish.
That's correct. We're looking at September 19th, I believe.
So questions of commissioners, Commissioner Slater, followed by Commissioner Ekus.
Thank you. Do we have the opportunity to be more restrictive in this code, or are we limited to simply implement what the state has?
We have to do the minimum, right? We can do more.
Excellent, thank you.
Commissioner Ekus.
I'm just trying to clarify where things are. What I have, or what I received is just an initiation of code amendment. Is there an actual draft or something that I do not have that I should have?
So staff report and the actual code amendments themselves will go out with the planning commission notice for the September 19th meeting. At this time, those code amendments aren't available yet.
Just to make sure I was.
Yeah.
Not missing something.
We'll get it in our documents. Any other questions for Austin or Lisa?
Well,
So that, Kashikas?
I'm not sure it's a question, it's more of a comment. I think it follows on Commissioner Slater's question. It's my hope that particularly things like the tree canopy and parking lots, that we will be fairly aggressive.
Okay. Perfect. Any other discussion? Commissioner Goldberg?
My question is, so between now and when the code amendment is put in front of the planning commission, what opportunities are there for us to be more active in the drafting of that, or is it just going to be a straight like one-to-one text of what the state requires? And then my follow-up question to that would be like, in what ways is the city going to engage the public and developers and like community organizations in getting their input on the like implementation of these state rules?
Lisa, that's okay. There's 3 questions.
Okay, first question, so the planning commission's opportunity to influence code amendment will be through the public hearing process. So we will draft what we think implements the state rule or any other way that we can use clarity, you know, to people in the code. And then at the hearing, there'll be time for debate, recommendations, motions, if you want to change it. You don't have to decide that night. We do technically have to have the rules adopted by the end of this year, and it has to go to council. But it's. I was joking, you know, if we're still working through the legislative process and we're communicating with the state that we're working with, that would be fine if we miss the deadline. Under our code, the planning commission has to issue a decision or recommendation of code amendment within 90 days of receiving it. So it means you can have multiple hearings potentially if you say, oh, we want you to go back and draft these things or look at those things or do this, right? It can be continued. So even though it's not a work session format, you still have the opportunity through the public hearing to provide input and have us do more work on that. And I think Austin can talk about what kind of outreach would be planned.
So we're planning to, obviously, through the public hearing process, hear from anyone who has input. I think because these are state mandated changes, unless there was a big drive to go well beyond the state requirements, the biggest aim of public outreach would be to help our regular applicants understand the implications of these changes so that they understand what they'll need to do in the future, because these are some pretty big changes that we don't currently necessarily have the mechanisms to review right now. And so it'll take some changes and some growth on the part of developers to make sure that they're complying with them. So we'll definitely do outreach at that stage.
Do you have any other questions, Commissioner Gold? I do need a motion on this because it's an action item, and so Commissioner Levin.
I would be happy to make a motion that we recommend staff to formalize a climate friendly and equitable communities update as part of the requirements for code adoption at city council. Did I get that right?
Will actually come in front of us.
Sorry, planning commission.
Just moving the process forward. Yeah. Second.
Second.
Slater's our second. Discussion on the motion. It's going to be a very interesting conversation. Commissioner Slater, and then followed by Commissioner Levin.
This is exciting. I'm looking forward to it.
Good. Commissioner Levin.
I'm going to approach this from another direction. So in the political sphere, you were, Austin, earlier before we started, you were talking about legislature and political climate and how things move. I know that sometimes other agenda items are tied to a bill that's moved through the legislature, and I'm wondering if this would be an opportune time, because of the short timeline on this, that staff might take some of those items that were recommended to be uses and occupancies that were recommended to be included into the office zone, and maybe piggyback that on if there's already code amendments happening, that maybe making a small adjustment to the office zone code would be financially beneficial to the city to do as a part of this. And I would recommend that we kind of tie that project with this. Something that I would, the reason I make that comment is that, especially what we're seeing in the business climate as far as the change in office occupancy. I've always been pretty vocal and candid about my displeasure about the lack of uses and occupancies that are allowed in the office zone in the city of Salem. And as we're seeing a major market shift, it's even more important to expand that list now so that we don't have gobs and gobs of vacant office space all over Salem, simply because that list of what's allowed in there is so restricted.
So can you give me an example of what you would see as a positive adjustment to the office zone?
Allowing cafe or retail sales in the office zone. Currently, it's a very, very tiny footprint that you could have a cafe. It is based on floor space, and then it's a limitation of how much of that floor, and then that cafe can only sell. So it's whittled down so much that there's very few opportunities where you could put a cafe in an office building where that's actually a large volume of people typically. Something that a past example was post-secondary education was not allowed, but counseling and group meeting or union halls were allowed. So a couple of years ago, I argued and challenged city council to amend office code, and we got that added. It was just one item. It was post-secondary education. It was so that a dance school could go into a building that was technically zoned office, which actually makes a lot of sense compared to other uses. So if we look at the zone code, there's just a lot of other uses that could apply. And it sounds weird to be tied with something like this, but and that's why I make the reference to the legislature, is a lot of times bills have stuff added onto them because they're needed based on the timeliness of what's happening. And as we've heard over the years from staff, we can't just afford the labor to go make code adjustments whenever willy-nilly we want, because it's such a new match. So if we're going to do this now, could we take some stuff off the bucket list and tie it to this so that the code is amended in several places?
Austin, you have thoughts on that?
We are already making a couple adjustments to the commercial office zone. In terms of the park and rides and single room occupancy. So that section of code, I guess, is open. I think it would require quick action to get it incorporated into the current proposed amendment, but that's definitely something that I think we could at least discuss.
Commissioner Levin's very quick.
I would defer to Lisa's expertise.
I don't think we've done a comprehensive look at all the uses of the CO. If you want to contact staff with some specific uses you want us to look at, we can try to do that real quick. I don't know that I can commit that we can look at like every use and do comprehensive look, like it's just a lot of work to look for zones and a lot of people on vacation. This hearing's going on really fast, so we're trying to cram this in. But I know what you're talking about with the schools and we made that change. I know the CO zone uses was on the old bucket list when I'm talking about. The cafes are weird in that zone. There's probably a time when they really wanted to protect the office uses as a really important, the economy and not turn it into a retail zone. But
Yeah.
we could probably tweak so everyone sense about that. Any of the commissioners want to go home and look at the CO zone and send us your thoughts and uses.
Yeah,
Do you have a follow-up?
I just think that it'd be very easy for myself to put together a list of some very obvious use and occupancies that wouldn't be challenging or difficult for staff to be able to pretty quickly review and identify that that is identical or similar to other existing uses.
Thanks, Commissioner Levin. Commissioner Ekus and then Commissioner Goble.
Well, I'm sympathetic to the issue on an office and office space, and but I think what Commissioner was talking about was trying to piggyback that onto this rule. These rules. And if that's the case, I really don't think that's a good idea. I mean, I understand the idea of trying to get efficient and everything, but you know, I've had some experience in the legislature, it's a long time ago, but you know, generally when you add stuff, it has to be in the same realm, similar topic. And my concern would be that this has a particular focus. This is states climate friendly and equitable communities, and it's a focus on climate change and the environment. I mean, maybe if we were talking about cooling centers or something in the office spaces, you could see it fit. My concern is that if you try and combine them, that you lose that focus on this particular route, and you may actually kind of lose the focus on both of them. Because they are just two different topics. And I support what the Commissioner said about looking at the office and occupancy rules, but I would be concerned about trying to piggyback them into this rulemaking. And a little focus away from this rulemaking, which is on a pretty specific defined set of state rules designed for a particular topic, climate change.
And I guess it would depend on the legislator, but the relating to costs could be often sense.
Yeah.
Commissioner Goble.
Yeah, I was gonna say something similar too. I completely agree with Commissioner Levin, and I cannabis should be allowed in every zone, but I think that yeah, I also agree that the separation of the two items is wise. And from my perspective, I think it's also just a way of being really clear about not circumventing the public process. And it's really convenient to be able to say like, well, those code amendments were they were required by the state. We just typed it off the backlist. We didn't have a whole lot of leeway on that. And it's something that's come up like in my professionally where like clients said like, you're on the planning commission, why did you like eliminate parking minimums? And like I can explain like the benefits of eliminating parking minimums, and I can also feel like it was also a state requirement. We didn't really have a lot of leverage there. But separating it out and then not also kind of like just like Austin was saying, like we're not really doing much public outreach, maybe like public education or like educating developers, but not necessarily like reaching out to their input on it. And I think that is an important part of the process when we're talking about changing, allowed uses and things like that. So while I definitely agree with Commissioner, I don't necessarily think this is the appropriate time for that.
Other comments this time? So the motion by Levin and seconded by Slater is to move this resolution initiating this whole process forward. And I'm just going to use your discretion judgment. Do you think that's an approach that we can open up that section, or if not that, if we could come back with a time frame, we could open that up and have a more robust. So we've got a motion. Just have discussion. Any more comments on that? All those signify by saying aye if you're in favor. Shelby, call the roll, and nay if you're opposed.
Commissioner Ekus.
Aye.
Commissioner Fott.
Aye.
Commissioner Goble.
Aye.
Commissioner Griggs.
Aye.
Commissioner Heller.
Aye.
Commissioner Levin.
Aye.
And Commissioner Slater.
Aye.
Motion passed. Thank you, Shelby. Item 5, public hearings. We have no public hearings. Item 6, special orders of business. 6.1, the greenhouse gas inventory. Here, going to do your presentation for us, and then be available for questions.
Okay, good evening, everyone. Let's get started. My name is Heather Dimke. I'm a management analyst with Public Works. And for the last, I think it's been 14 months, I've had an opportunity to staff the city's newly formed Climate Action Plan Committee, as well as to help coordinate some of the early action items that we have identified under that plan. One of those action items that we did just complete this spring in March was our 2021 inventory of community greenhouse gas emissions for Salem. So the slides that I have tonight, I was hoping to quickly speak to what these inventories provide, process that's used, of course, share the results from 2021, and then offer a quick comparison to the results that we did receive in 2019 when we completed our first inventory. All right, so jumping right in, what exactly is a greenhouse gas inventory? Why did we do this? In short, these provide an idea, of the sources of greenhouse gases. And they also provide quantities of greenhouse gases, typically within city limits or another jurisdictional boundary. It can be the county, state level. These can also be completed for different agencies or organizations who wish to have a total of their emissions that they're producing as well. They rely upon a discrete set of data for a certain period of time, often, which was the case for us here at the city. We looked at data for a calendar year for both of these inventories that we've completed. Most of these greenhouse gas inventories also look primarily at the three most common greenhouse gases. So we're looking at carbon dioxide, we're looking at methane and nitrous oxide. They do consider in their final results that each of these gases has a different global warming or heat trapping potential. That's factored into the final emission results, which are generally reported in metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalent, or what you'd see is CO2e. So metric ton CO2e. These inventories are used now really across the world. It's my understanding for different entities, cities, organizations that are looking to establish a baseline of conditions within their boundary. And then they're repeated at concurrent intervals. Typically, I think it's every couple of years to track changes or monitor progress over time. So in general, there's two different types of greenhouse gas emission inventories that municipalities utilize. One is the sector-based and the other is called a consumption-based inventory. Sector-based inventories are looking specifically at emissions from certain producing activities that are created within city limits from those activities or directly right outside. Some examples are transportation, energy use, and creation of waste. These rely very heavily on data that's available and collected from a variety of local sources, as well as state sources and federal sources as well, very data heavy. And they're most commonly the type used by cities for goal setting purposes and for continued monitoring. So looking at consumption-based inventories, these are quite different. They're much broader in scope. They're also looking at the emissions that are produced within a boundary as well as globally. And they're specifically looking at emissions produced through the consumption of goods and services. So consumption-based inventory is looking specifically at consumption behaviors and choices. And the emissions that are calculated are global in scale. So you're looking at for any particular product or good, you're looking at the emissions that are produced from perhaps the mining of the materials for that product, all the way through transport across the world through disposal. The results of consumption-based inventories are generally much higher than that which we see in the sector-based. And they, to my understanding, rely heavily on consumer expenditure data from the Bureau of Economic Analysis, which is what we used previously. So to date, the city of Salem has completed 2 sector-based inventories, 1 consumption-based inventory. Our first sector-based was completed in 2019, And that used data from calendar year 2016. And I think that's important to point out because it's that 2016 data set that established the baseline for the city's recently adopted greenhouse reduction goals, which are posted on the screen. By year 2035, we do intend to reduce by 50% and for the city to be carbon neutral by year 2050. Our second sector-based report is the one that we just completed this spring. And again, that was calendar year 2021 data. So touching quickly on the consumption-based inventory, again, we've done just the one back in 2020. We do anticipate doing a repeat, doing an update of that within the next probably 2.5 years or 2 to 5 years. And that's not the focus of my slides tonight, but I did want to, in looking back at the results from that, I did want to share that vehicles and vehicle parts were the highest for Salem consumption-based source of emissions. I didn't provide an example. Is there any questions about the two? Is that confusing at all?
I think Commissioner Goble has a question.
Yes. Thank you, Heather. I appreciate this. In the context of sector-based inventory, I guess I don't understand what carbon neutrality means like practically. Can you kind of break that down?
Yeah, that's a tough, my understanding, carbon neutrality, we're still going to be producing carbon emissions, but the hope is that by that time, we're able to also sequester the same amount, as much carbon as we're releasing so that it's a net neutrality. If that makes sense, that is the goal.
I think that makes sense. But I guess when I think of carbon neutral, I think of a consumption-based framework, right? And I guess so when you're eliminating or like, is that through like carbon offsets or like electric vehicle charging stations and things like that, where that would be like an offset to commercial activities that would be like a sector-based production of carbon?
Well, it's a great question. We really haven't explored it, to be honestly, too much just yet, but it would be through offsets, I imagine, which can be spendy. It sounds like, and also likely through different sequestration practices, which we're just kind of starting to learn about. So I think there's plenty to learn about. It will be very likely a mix of different things that are going to be needed to get us there. But yeah, it's a great question.
Thank you.
Any other questions at this point? I think Heather's still going. Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and jump right in to the two sector-based inventories that we completed. Again, data from 2016 and 2021. So just touch quickly on the processes that we use, some of the data that was collected, and then of course go through the results and compare the two. There were some differences between the two inventories, but I think it's important to point out that both of these were completed in accordance with what's called the Global Protocol for Community Scale Inventories, or GPC. And that's a globally accepted framework or methodology, if you will, for the tracking, reporting, calculation of emissions. And it's really important because it ensures consistency in that data collection, calculation, and it really ensures consistency so that we can compare results across the world. So per that GPC, for those requirements in both inventories, we looked at 6 different emission source categories or sector source categories. This included those on the screen, stationary energy, so the energy use in our buildings, which includes natural gas, electricity, and other fuels. We looked at transportation emissions, so vehicles, aviation, public transit, our chariots, and the end rail. We looked at emissions from our wastewater treatment process, from local industries, waste produced as we produce solid waste and send that to the landfill or conveyance in our case, the emissions produced from that. And then we also looked at emissions produced as well as removed through agriculture, forestry, and changes in land use and same. So I wanted to just touch briefly on some of the data suppliers that provided the critical data for us. This is a big piece. Obviously, our local utilities provided us the much needed stationary data, electricity and natural gas. We did receive solid waste information from both Marion County as well as the Mid-Valley Garbage Haulers Association. Local industry data was sourced from the DEQ, Department of Environmental Quality. We were thankful to staff to provide us the wastewater data. And then at least in 2016, we received our vehicle miles traveled data through the Midland Valley Council of Governments. And specifically, we used a Salem Kaiser area travel demand model for that data. What we found, unfortunately, when we did the 2021, when we started collecting the data, was that particular model had been updated at least a couple different times. And we learned that we just, unfortunately, we're not going to be able to repeat that data for 2021. So we were actually guided by our consultant through this next process to what's called Google Environmental Insights Explorer data. Basically on the ground cell phone data. It's free, it's publicly available, and it's a pretty robust data set. That was what was recommended by our consultant. So that's what we ended up using. I think moving forward, it's going to be a huge benefit to us. It's again easily accessible, and we're going to have a robust, consistent data set. But unfortunately, it did cause some challenges as we tried to look back and do a comparison to 2016. And then I just wanted to quickly point out, we did receive, thanks to our partners here, some additional data for 2021 that we didn't have in 2016. And so here we are with the totals, the annual emission totals from each. What you can see is in 2021, we had just over 1.2 million metric tons of that carbon dioxide equivalent calculated for Salem city limits. This equates to just under 7 metric tons per person. 2016, conversely, it's a little bit higher, right? We're seeing 1.5, a little bit more than 1.5 million metric tons of that CO2e, almost 10 metric tons per person. It's a difference about 300,000 metric tons. And while it would be awesome, I wish I could say that we have reduced our emissions by that much in 5 years. Unfortunately, looking at the data, it was that vehicle miles travel data. There was a 40% jump between the 2 years that stood out to us. We know there's been some changes due to COVID and people working from home, but a 40% drop is very unlikely. So something that we're going to have to keep monitoring as we move forward to the next inventory. And here's a look at the data. This is a breakdown of the different emission source activities or sector sources. Again, for this particular one, we have separated out electricity from natural gas, which is the stationary fuel. What you can see in both charts, I think clearly, is that mobile or transportation emissions is the highest in both years. It does jump significantly down from 53% in 2016 down to 41%. Again, we have the change in data. And another interesting piece is that the 42% combined of electricity and natural gas that we saw in 2016, that jumps up, fills that difference in 2021 to where we're at 55% of the total from both of those sources. So 55% from electricity and natural gas roughly in our latest update. What you can see also is that water, wastewater, waste generation, the totals up there, they flip a little bit, but they do remain fairly insignificant compared to those other larger sectors.
I'm sure you just ask a question.
Oh, sure.
Can you briefly describe again, if you did, what the electricity factors are based on? Is that based on the carbon emissions that it takes to generate the electricity that the city of Salem uses?
Yes, it is. It's pretty basic calculation of kilowatt hours. So we get usage data from the local utilities, and then roughly that's multiplied by, it's called an emission factor.
Yeah.
And we actually had local emission factors for PG and Salem Electric.
So that would reflect to the extent that natural gas is used to generate electricity.
It does factor that. Yeah.
And did you say that your electricity figure includes, when you said includes natural gas,
Oh, no, my apologies, it's stationary, we have mobile electricity stationary, fuel after stationary is the natural gas.
Stationary is natural gas, okay, thank you, understood. But the electricity would include the natural gas that's used to generate electricity, stationary would include the direct use of
That's correct,
natural gas. Okay,
yes.
thank you.
Thanks.
I have one quick question.
Commissioner Slater?
So, electricity and stationary, those are for building usage, like heating, water heating, cooling?
Right, yes.
Okay. So, okay, thank you.
And here's another look. This is a different breakdown slightly. For this particular pie chart, we pulled out residential versus commercial and industrial energy use versus the natural gas and electricity. Again, still we're seeing that transportation is still the highest, 41% in this last year. But that commercial and industrial energy piece does take the next largest chunk. Again, we're still at 55% between the two, so it's pretty significant. So a few key takeaways from our latest update. Mentioned this a few times, transportation has continued despite our change in data source, has continued to be the largest single source of emissions. But I think it's important to note, that increase that we're seeing, 55% of the total is now tied to our building energy use, which is big. And I think we can reasonably expect that that's only going to continue to grow. So any activities that we can do to promote energy efficiency and promote renewable energy are going to be significant. And then finally, it was 5 years between our last inventory. It was recommended that we start doing these at more routine intervals. So likely going to try to do the two years. We're saying 2 to 5. If we can do every couple of years, I think that would be awesome as we move forward.
So Heather, I would assume then that if you do it in 2 years, that with the data sets being the same, this year from 21 to 2 years, we'll have a clearer picture, more accurate picture.
Absolutely, I think we will.
The changes of data sets.
Yeah, I think there's still going to be some small changes, unfortunately, over time, but that was a big one.
Yeah.
So I don't anticipate things of that magnitude.
Commissioner Heller, then Commissioner Goble.
Is your, this information, the charts and presentation, is that available online?
Well, I don't have the presentation posted yet. I certainly can, but the report, the final report is available online.
Okay.
It's actually on the climate action plan. It's on the homepage for them.
Great, thank you.
Commissioner Goble.
Thank you again, Heather. You did a great job on the presentation. I wanted to say I love the data. I love looking at this and saying, okay, what can we improve over time? And one thing that jumps out to me is that energy sector and fuel consumption is a very I feel like a much more, or energy consumption, a much more linear, when I think of reduction, and correct me if I'm wrong, obviously you're the expert, but I wanted when I think about just including more sustainable energy sources, more solar panels, more natural fuel sources, it's pretty clear how we get from here to there, right? Through subsidies and through incentives, and that's a pretty clear path there. And transportation, I feel like, is an anomaly because it's so difficult to figure out what would it take to get people to stop driving, right? I feel like that's not, it's such a more convoluted and complex equation. And for me personally, I was getting a little bit of environmental guilt, and I just, for the fun of it, looked up what it would take to be able to ride the bus to work, right? And so if I was going to take the bus from my house to daycare, do daycare drop off, and then go from daycare to work, and then do the same in reverse at the end of the day, it would take 2 hours each way. And if I didn't miss any buses, and about a half mile of walking total with 2 kids. And so in looking at that and figuring and I love as a planning commission that we're making incremental but meaningful progress towards making that more possible for residents, of all mobilities, abilities, families, and living situations and where we're living. And I think there's so much we can do and so much we are doing, and I'm so encouraged by the momentum behind that. But I think that like, we are right to have transportation be at the forefront of this policymaking because it is such a complex equation. And I'm sure Commissioner Slay has more to say on that. I just wanted to put that out there. And I was discouraged to see like that I would have to like leave the house at 5 a.m. and leave work at 3 p.m. and make a bus trip happen. But I just wanted to kind of put that out there as like another perspective when we're having these conversations about like what it looks like on the ground in terms of reducing our transportation emissions.
I think Commissioner Akins.
Thank you. This I understand is an inventory. But we do have some state and federal legislation that sets some targets for certain things. There is a target for electricity reduction of use of natural gas or CO2 emissions. There's a target for electric vehicles. And I'm wondering if in the process of doing the inventory, I'm wondering here where in our planning, are we getting, you got any projections of what the impact on the inventory might be if we actually start to meet those goals? And because it seems to me the biggest factors here, those are the two biggest factors. If we actually achieve the goals of electric vehicles and achieve the goals, I think the utilities are required by a certain date, like 2040 something, I forget. How that, do you have any projections or any ideas of targets in relation to those, what impact would those two goals have on the targets that were set and then overall goals? And how might that reduce the inventory? It's the interaction of those two goals and our CO2 picture, greenhouse gas picture.
It's a wonderful question. I know that we did, and I think it's quite complicated, we did do some forecasting as part of the climate action plan development process. I don't know how involved that was. If we looked at some of these recent legislation as part of that, we have not done any projections or forecasting recently. This was our first kind of check-in, if you will, update. But I've heard that interest from others in us diving in and trying to do that. So Robert, did you have an addition?
Hey everybody, I'm Robert Chandler, Assistant Director of Public Works. Not so much, I think you've answered it very well that we're looking at it. The hard part is we can do a lot well as individuals and small changes, but we lost in the noise, let's say major something occurs. And a lot of transportation is one of the major contributors to greenhouse gases. That's not an engineering or a technical issue, that's a cultural issue. Is a financial one and want more bus routes and easier access and more regular routes and all the things that make people want to ride the bus. That requires a higher tax. So there's all, I think last time I did different content, we talked about trade-offs, and that's among the things I'm hopeful for is we don't have data because we shifted our data set for transportation, really looking forward to looking at how the data then a couple of years on our inventory, what happens there, hoping that we don't have another pandemic that complicates things as well.
If I could, yeah, I understand. It's really complicated. And there's a lot of cultural factors. And, can we really get the EV goals? And if we do, can we find a way to finance road maintenance when we don't use the gas tax? There's lots of factors there, but it's just an interesting thing to me that we have these laws out there that set some goals, and it seems that one of the things I want to look at, see what we can figure out is what, if we achieve those goals or some of those timelines, what impact it might have, because it might serve as a reference point for or justification for trying to move the cultural needle a little farther along. And I'm saying that without actually necessarily knowing how difficult it is to do that. And I realize it's difficult. Seems to me that at some point that's a nice reference point. It says, look, this law says this. And if I mean, PG might already have this, what would the CO2 emissions in our area be if they actually met their goal? If they actually met their goal of by 2040, because our goal is neutrality by 2050. What impact would that have on us reaching our goals? Same with the EVs. I believe I understand the cultural aspects of it, because I've done a different calculation with trying to decide which car to buy, and is it worth the extra cost compared to the amount of I drive and the cost of gas and things like that. But that's on the current market. It's not on future market and availability of EVs and cost impacts that might have. I think at some point, it's something to keep in mind as we're doing this. Is be nice to have sort of we've got these targets. How are those targets going to be affected if we meet the targets that are already in law?
Good comments. Any other questions of Jennifer? Commissioner Slater.
Maybe a comment and then I'll end with the question, just to the agenda here. My thought on some of this is that there's a danger in making some of this too complicated and getting caught up in modeling and math. There are some general numbers out there that we know. For example, heating and cooling buildings and water is about 25% of gas emissions or 25% of CO2 emissions. We have the tools now to move that number quite a bit. It's the question of whether we want to put some of those tools in place. I mean, Commissioner Levin probably knows better than I do, but there are many opportunities in the life cycle of a building to increase efficiencies out there. From replacing HVAC systems, to replacing roofs, to replacing windows. And every one of those opportunities is a chance to kind of ratchet down energy use and increase efficiency. The question is whether or not those opportunities are built in or encouraged by our code. And then kind of on the market side, whether those are efficient for people, whether it pencils out for people or closely pencils out for people when they do it. So I think that is one thing the city can look at in our own code, is to say, okay, you're going to be replacing your HVAC system. What are you replacing your HVAC system with? And that is something that we can talk about in the planning commission. And I think we can have a conversation with the city council about what kind of subsidies or discounts we might be able to provide as a city, whether it's a tax rebate or something, and how that stacks up with other federal and state programs. Talking about goals, the state just set a goal of 500,000 new heat pumps installed over the next decade. That would make a significant impact. How can Salem connect with that? So I'd say in terms of some of these major numbers that we're looking at, there's a way that we can start to tackle that. It's the same with transportation. We're looking at completely refiguring our road systems and our land use systems. What we really need to do is over the next decade, get everyone to buy an electric car. We have an electric car and we have a clean energy portfolio. We literally have solved a large portion of the transportation problem. So the question is, how do we get people when they buy their car, what people tend to do every 16 years, how do we get people then to switch from a gas car to an electric car? And from the land use perspective, how do we support electric cars, which is where we put in the EV infrastructure, how well does it work? These are the kind of questions that I think we as a planning commission can help figure out and move those numbers, I think, in a pretty significant way, if we can tie them to financial incentives and other incentives that are out there through the state and federal government. There is a plan that we can put in place because we can take advantage of these replacement cycles that people have with cars, with building parts and things like that, that kind of significant difference. And I understand that at some point in the future, maybe Heather, you can answer this, Salem will have an opportunity to buy into a clean energy portfolio. We have a green tariff coming at some point in the next several years.
Yes, PGE, that was baked into House Bill 2021, that PGE and Pacific Power can create a new green tariff program that would be opt-out, as it's worded in the code. So it's something that the umbrella tariff is something that PGE and others are working on right now. It doesn't sound like I think they were working to file by the end of the year, hopefully with the Utilities Commission, but that's kind of yet to be determined. So it is a ways out. They're working on it.
So if we look at it, if we take 2035 as a goal and start working backwards on some of these replacement dates, I think there's a bigger potential to move the needle than we might otherwise think.
Thank you, Commissioner Slater. Any other comments or questions for Jennifer? It was great with the words. Jennifer, I really appreciate the time you're going. I would not want your job. Commissioner Slater, did you have any comment?
Yeah. Heather, could you talk a little bit about what the city is doing to try and meet some of these goals?
Certainly, yes. We've got a lot of different activities underway, actually. The climate action plan itself has almost 200 different strategies embedded in it. And there's a number of that are underway across the city. Focus that I have been working on for our work plan, we are looking at for transportation, we're looking at potentially charging for downtown parking in the central business district. It's something that's currently under review. We just recently eliminated parking minimums across the city. I think that was in May, so that was a big one. Let's see, transportation.
Do we have any electric vehicles on our fleet?
We do have, I think it's one, maybe two by now, electric vehicles. We did create a policy to transition eventually our vehicle fleet over to electric, as well as our equipment. We're working on that as well. We're working on a huge transportation thing, is the transportation system plan that's now underway. That's other staff are working on, multi-year effort that's incorporating funding and equitable rulemaking into that. So that's a big one. Energy wise, we're looking at right now from our work plan for this year is a comprehensive approach to reducing our own energy use in our municipal buildings. A big one, that's something that I'm looking into different options for right now. We received grant funding for the state's first microgrid, community microgrid at our new public works building. That's just kind of a few examples of many different things that are underway as part of the convention.
I think Robert has something to add, judging by body language.
Yes, I can add a couple more also. Interestingly, on the list that Heather provided us for a while. We are reviewing and updating our transportation system plan that incorporates a lot of these policies and practices. It's a long process going on that includes scenario planning from a regional basis on climate actions. We are reporting on our greenhouse gas emissions regularly now. We saw part of that now. We are close to hiring a full-time climate action plan manager. We are looking at on the concept of electric vehicles on our fleet. We have approval for funding to buy the first ever for us electric street sweeper. Yeah, that's really exciting. I'm really excited. Yeah. And as you might imagine, there's a lot of other partnerships go along with this. We work with Energy Trust of Oregon, certainly working with the utilities. We're working with Energy Trust of Oregon, and we started updating our natural hazard mitigation plan, and we're working on expanding our EV charging network. We're a partner with 12
and 10 others, yeah.
But in other jurisdictions, it's 15, between the number $15 million EV grant program. So a lot of things on.
Yeah, sounds like it. Sounds like you're busy, which is great. Any other questions or comments, Jen? Heather. Jennifer's next because thank you. I think we're finished with that one. And just, we're now do 6.2, goal 5, our third inventory presentation with Jennifer and Jeffrey, and I don't know who is going first.
Good evening, my name is Jeff Johnson. I'm a natural resources planner in Public Works. Jennifer Mongolo, our senior natural resources planners here with you tonight. We appreciate the opportunity to come give some information about the Goal 5 Riparian Corridor planning project we're working on. Our hope is that this will give you some information to understand the process, where we are, and there will be some time towards the end for questions, but if you can get them. So goal 5 was in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of population growth that was happening in Oregon. It's happening really fast. There was concerns about land use. There were concerns about industries that take a lot of land, like timber and agriculture. There were concerns about urban sprawl and the environment. And so the legislature in 73 passed Senate Bill 100-101 that set up these 19 statewide planning goals. And it directed local governments to do inventories and to adopt comprehensive plans and then to revise them from time to time. So public works staff have been directed by city council to begin the Goal 5 Riparian Corridor inventory process. So of the statewide planning goals, Goal 5 specifically covers natural resources, scenic and historic resources, as well as open space. We are currently just focusing on the riparian corridor portion of that goal. And Goal 5 sets out a two-phase process. It includes a local inventory and assessment, and then a comprehensive plan, policies, ordinances that have weight and law behind. So what is a riparian corridor? The way it's defined in Goal 5, it includes these areas of water resources, fish habitat, adjacent riparian areas, and wetlands. So here on the screen, the water resources are shown with purple color, pink color, and that includes the waterway, which we're showing the stream here, but it can be a pond or a lake, whatever. It also includes wetlands within that same area. Now, the riparian areas on the left and right, riparian areas are the transition zone between an aquatic or a water resource and a terrestrial resource or area upstream. So they have a lot of importance because they serve as that transition zone. But the riparian areas themselves, including the corridor, has a lot of functions ecologically for us as well as for the human environment. So they act like a filter and a sponge. So they'll filter out sediments, nutrients, pollutants, both coming down into the waterway from the outside of the riparian area and as it moves through the riparian. They also absorb water. There's high water. Basically, if you imagine that's a cup and it fills up with water, the soil absorbs all of that water. And then as the water level drops, it will slowly release that back into the waterway, thus keeping water in streams for longer, which provides excellent fish and other habitat. It also helps keep water cooler. Riparian areas shade our streams and help keep water cooler. That way, they also provide a lot of inputs and nutrients into the streams. They're very important for groundwater recharge. And my favorite part is just they're very beautiful. It's really nice to be in them. It's nice to have access to them. And there's even been studies that have shown that property values increase when you're closer to a riparian. All right, so why specifically plan for them here in the city? We want to make sure that anything we do is locally appropriate and effective. We don't want to just do it and so we want to make sure that we reduce uncertainty across the board for everyone involved. We want to take those values to human beings and values to the environment and habitat. We want to maximize those and safeguard them. And of course, we also want to comply with the statewide requirement for planning for that. So in your packets, each of you has a handout, has this on the front. It's a lot of detail to put on the slide. So Goal 5 is set up in a way that there is 2 phases. There's this inventory phase that I mentioned and then there's the protection phase. So we are currently just working on phase 1 in public works. And then phase 2 at the end of our phase, we will give that to community development department. They will take it and take care of the coding, giving it the weight of law. Policy changes. So there are suggestions in the goal 5 inventory process. Excuse me, we get 2. One is a safe harbor approach, which is required if you use it to be placed on all fish-bearing streams in the state. There's a standard approach, which has a lot more detail and a lot more adjustments based on conditions on the ground. So I'd like to just give you some examples of each of those 2 types. So safe harbor has prescribed setback for all fish-bearing waterways. If a fish-bearing waterway is large enough that it has flows of over 1,000 cubic feet per second, such as the Willamette River, it's a 75-foot buffer placed on from the bank, each bank out. Now, all of the other streams in Salem don't qualify as that large major river, so they would all get a 50-foot buffer placed on them. Now, there's wetlands that are shown here as A, B, and C, and wetlands that are directly adjacent to waterways such as A are included. Wetlands such as B that are within the buffer of the stream are also included in the buffer is moved around to include those wetlands. Now, wetland C is disconnected, and so it, while important, it would not be included in this inventory process. The benefits of this are that it's a given number applied across the city in a consistent way. And so that reduces liability, liability, reduces the chance of litigation, which is nice, and it's more simple to implement in place. Safe harbor does not look at different parts of the stream differently. That's where this standard inventory approach suggestion from the state comes from. Basically, it is broken up by stream reach. Each one gets a specific setback. It's determined based on the conditions on the ground. So normally it's based on the height of the tallest tree, the average height of the tallest tree in the riparian. It has a lot more data inputs. It requires justifying both the methodology and the data, and it does often lead to more litigation than the safe harbor approach. That said, it is preferred often by conservationists because, as you can see, it tends to have a larger zone, just that 50-foot setback. So internally, we've come up with this proposed approach that I'm calling Safe Harbor Plus, or we're calling Safe Harbor Plus. We want to take those prescribed setbacks and then apply them to all of the waterways in the city, not just to fish-bearing streams. Part of that is we want to do the mapping, so we need to hire a consultant to help us come up with a final map of what the waterways are in Salem. So they're going to look at check wetlands data, permits, and things along those corridors to see where are the wetlands that we've had inventoried since the previous inventory was completed. Now, what we want to do with that map is take it and present it to the public in a way that they can send in edits and public errors or up to ground truth things, and then we'll revise the map based on those comments. And our deliverable will be a map of Salem's waterways to community development. Excuse me. So you also have this on the back of your packet. This is just a very preliminary map that we worked on fish-bearing and non-fish-bearing streams in the city. So the purple's fish-bearing, and the green is the green lines are the non-fish-bearing streams. So out of the 110 miles in the city, about 78 would be protected if we just did fish-bearing streams. We leave the entire 32 miles approximately of unprotected streams, just that are not protected because they're not fish-bearing. They're very important for water quality, water quantity, reduction of pollutants. You can't just feed a bunch of stuff into the top of a fish bearing stream and expect it to just have good habitat without protecting all of those inputs. And so that's why we are leaning towards including all the non-fish bearing properties, because it will actually be effective as we protect fish bearing streams as well. Our draft timeline, we hope to have this done in about a year. So we're going to take this quarter. We've been doing lots of outreach plan to neighborhood associations, watershed councils, and other groups. We'll continue to do that throughout the process. We have begun the preliminary mapping that you just saw. We have to extend that now to include the non-fish bearing streams. We haven't buffered those yet. And then we'll use that data to give to the consultant so that they can refine it, check it, and come up with a final waterways map. And again, we're going to go public comment, and we hope to have all that done, final map revisions in, and a deliverable community development and then forward through next year. So here is Jennifer and my contact information. Feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions after this. Are there any questions now?
Commissioner Akins, followed by Commissioner Vogel, followed by Senator Rizzo.
Just a second, grab that.
That's I bet you might need it. Because.
As I understand it, and the goal is like third quarter next year to have some buffers created. It would include the non-fish waterways, Salem.
Yes and no. So it will provide the streams and all those locations that will be buffered, but it'll be part of the planning review process where the buffer itself will actually be determined. The developer or whomever will have to measure where the edge of the bank is and apply that buffer as part of that.
Yeah, that's my question. So I was trying to wonder if we have any developments now in process that are encroaching on what would be.
That's a great question, and I didn't know the answer. Do you, Robert?
I don't know the answer, but I'll just clarify. So the schedule that Ms. Johnson put up is for us to complete the data and information collection, not to have the regulations in place. We're just collecting, not just, it's a big undertaking, but mapping and identifying, doing the inventory part one. Part two, which becomes more exciting, is now what do you do with it in order to balance what is locally appropriate between optimizing the needs and safeguarding the resources.
And I think Commissioner Akins, Lisa has a follow-up to your question. Or answer to your question.
So at the end of this, like Jeff said, it will then go through an adoption process, like a code amendment, and then it won't be a law, right? Until so that whole process, like a hearing, planning commission, and so and under state law, it's the rules that are in place the day you submit your application are the rules that apply. So there will undoubtedly be many elements in the process that maybe people are going to say, oh no, but this project and this is going to change it. I have to say, unfortunately, those rules aren't adopted yet today, so they don't have to similar to the tree code. People developing, it was in the works and even approved, but not effective yet. We've got those big trees. So.
Did you have a follow-up, Commissioner Akins?
No,
You're good?
no, I don't. It just seemed to me like we're gonna likely face that issue that we'll have some development proposals that for which the future rules that need to be developed will not apply, just as we had with the Salem situation.
Okay. Commissioner Gopal, followed by Commissioner Slater. Oh, I thought I saw your name. Okay, thank you.
Okay, so as far as the safe harbor, am I correct in remembering that we did apply the 50-foot safe harbor setback to middle housing when we did the.
So, and Lisa, please, if I'm wrong, my understanding is the state has a mandated 100-foot setback from the stream bank for middle housing. And that cannot be waived unless you have a Rule 5 process and those buffers set in place. So when this was all done, it would replace that 100-foot requirement with whatever was decided to be the buffer. Is that correct, Lisa?
Yeah, that's correct, and it was really put in place because of Salem, because we don't have this inventory. I always think of Salem jail, planner jail, it's been a problem for a few middle housing developments. We've had some
Yeah.
proposals where just the entire lot, you know, it's a small lot, they couldn't build anything because of that. Although, you know,
Except
I don't have the
family
data to
house.
say in the future, yeah, if they're built.
Mhm. Yeah, no, I remember that being an issue where developers were like, I can't build middle housing on my lot, but I could build a single family home. And so with that, I mean, I think, does that also kind of provide us like a small, like, taste of what the implications of this are gonna be when we see how this impacted the way that we've applied that 100-foot setback? Thus far, can we kind of use that as a test case to say this, how this impact, depending on which way we go, how it impact the amount of developable land, how will it conflict potentially with our housing goals or transportation goals or other things like that?
Yeah, I mean, I think through this project, we would be looking at specific properties and we could look at them and see how does it affect the development potential. It's going to impact more. There's going to be less development potential on property that are, you know, and we have to think, obviously balance the trade-offs that was talking about. Yeah, community.
So probably during that public outreach piece, that's, I'm sure some of the developers may raise some concerns, but you know, as other people will be raising messages, there will be some naysayers. Yeah.
So the safe harbor is the safe harbor 50-foot setbacks only required for fish bearing waterways, is that correct?
It is only required by the legislation for the fish bearing waterways.
Gotcha, so we'd be looking at extending that to the additional 32 miles of non-fishing streams. And then, okay, and I apologize, they didn't really think this one out prior to this meeting, so if this is a discussion of the time, that's fine. But I remembered that there were some issues recently with the Supreme Court decision that limited the authority of the EPA to regulate different waterways, and I'm sure you know much more about that, and so maybe you could speak to how that impacts our goals here, or if what it has been like the changes to what's considered a waterway. Is that included in this?
Sure. I think this is a good one to pass to Jen. She knows a lot about this.
Right, thank you. Jennifer Mongolo, Senior Natural Resources Planner. Fred might also have thoughts on this. We talked a lot about the second case that you're referring to that limited the EPA's ability to regulate wetlands that did not have surface water connection with waters of the US. I think the riparian corridor planning process the state set forward goes beyond any state or federal jurisdictions and regulations that were already in place for protecting waterways and wetlands. So even without that recent ruling, this would still be going beyond what the federal government and state governments require for protections for wetlands, because those regulations, even prior to that case, only covered the actual wetland and the actual waterways, no buffer. So people could build right up to that and only need a permit if they're going to be building within the waterway or the wetland. With the EPA not being able to, with the changes in the water, what's the definition of waters of the US, it is really not a huge change for Salem because we have the Oregon state laws that are more strict already or more conservative already about protection of waterways and wetlands than the federal laws. So we didn't really see a lot of changes here in Salem with regard to permitting for impacts to wetlands and waterways, just because we have that state framework. No, but answers your question well enough.
That does, thank you. That's really helpful. Yeah, I think that's the last of my questions. I appreciate that.
Did you have anything to add?
No, I think Jennifer covered it
really well. It really doesn't, that case didn't make any much of a difference at all for Salem because that just restricted the Fed's jurisdiction. And the state has enacted laws to do the same sort of thing to protect wetlands here. So the only real difference is in some cases where you used to have to get a permit from the Department of State Lands and the Corps of Engineers. Now you just have to get one from the Department of State Lands, which might speed things up for people, but it really won't affect what's protected.
Commissioner Heller.
My question was answered.
Okay, asked and answered.
Well, now I have a question.
No, I think they already scratched your name out. Okay, go ahead.
So the wetland inventory that we're doing originated here in the commission because of a very complicated case that we had over a year ago. And one of the issues in that case was the fact that it was a seasonal waterway, not a 12-month waterway. Can you speak to this issue of seasonal waterways and how they are, how you were thinking through that issue?
Great question. So a lot of those seasonal waterways are those non-fish bearing streams. So those headwaters in those areas that's where a lot of those occur. And my understanding is that this will provide us a map so that there's not really questions and as to whether something is a stream or not. And that hopefully will come out through a public process and through the consultant reviewing, rectifying the data.
That's very helpful. Just in the course of your work overall, do you have any sort of inventory of the types of flora and fauna that are in the waterways and riparian areas? Is that something that you monitor at all?
I wouldn't say we have exactly an inventory of vegetation in the waterways, but we do work a lot in riparian corridors already, especially our stormwater quality staff. They're constantly doing planting projects. We certainly know a great deal about what vegetation is dominant in most of our riparian corridors in Salem, as well as the challenges and the size of actual riparian areas and in some areas. So willows, dogwood, cottonwoods, Oregon ash, very common tree species, native tree species in the riparian areas. Also, we have a lot of invasives that we're dealing with, blackberry and yellow black iris and those sorts of things. But we could provide a pretty decent list if we were asked to of the predominant vegetation types that we find here.
Yeah, I guess I was just curious if we're in any way sort of monitor and inventory both the health not only of flora but fauna as well. Are we looking at amphibians? Are we looking at other critters? I'll just say critters.
So
I'm curious because I think we have a pretty good potential system here in Salem, and we seem to be moving in that direction, which I think is really good. So I'm just interested in how deep we're going in some senses.
So if we were to go the standard inventory route that Jeff mentioned, that is where we would start evaluating those sorts of things on every reach of stream in Salem. We would look at what's the predominant vegetation covered, what's the health of that vegetation, what's the, what animals are using that, what wildlife is using it. And there's a very detailed process. There's boots on the ground actually going out and surveying these things. And the stream reaches, then reach by reach, side by side, the channel can end up with different buffer distances depending on the calculations from those surveys that the consultant would do. It's a lot more complicated, it would take a lot longer, and I'm not sure. In a lot of Salem, my thought is that a lot of our fish bearing streams especially are already very highly developed around. So a 50-foot corridor and those 50-foot setback and a lot of those streams would end up being a smaller setback with a standard inventory. And then in the undeveloped properties, we might end up with wider than a 50-foot setback because we do have healthy vegetation, tall trees growing along those streams. But that is an option, but as Jeff said, we're suggesting going the safe harbor approach because it is a faster approach. It's straightforward. It limits our litigation potential later on, and it's a much more protective than anything we have right now.
Thank you. Other questions for Jeff and Jen? Okay, thank you. Great report. Appreciate it.
Thank you for the opportunity to come and speak.
You betcha. Moving on to information report reports, item 7, we have none of those. We don't have any subcommittee reports. And the administrative report.
Let's see, just looking ahead at the, calendars. Yes. Yes, I will. We have a new admin staff back there, Shelby's training, Jennifer Giverson.
She hasn't left the room yet. That's
It's Jennifer's second day. So
Welcome.
it was an easy meeting to not scare her away. Crazy public hearing. So we're very excited to have Jennifer here. And thank Shelby again for showing up and training. In addition to her other new job. We don't have any items right now for September 5th, and I think our deadline to schedule anything is tomorrow, already passed.
The deadline's passed for public hearings. But we'll send out the normal potential cancellation email. And I'll give you guys a deadline on that.
The commissioner.
Retroactive deadline. I'm just kidding.
We give a shorter deadline to the commissioners. Want to add something to the agenda. We do have on the 19th, the code amendment that Austin was here to talk about tonight. And I'm hoping that the resolution would pass. And that's all we have scheduled so far. At council last night, I think last time I was here, I talked about the appeal is going forward for 436 unit apartment complex in West Salem, across from the high school. You read about that in the paper. Council had a hearing, the written record opened with the 777, you know about. And they had deliberations last night. And they did affirm the decision, so they approved the proposal. They affirmed the staff decision, which was to approve everything except deny the request to exceed maximum parking and 63 conditions of approval. It was not unanimous. The Ward 8 councilor voted against it. So yeah, that was a pretty long hearing at the meeting before. I think if there's something else. Oh, I don't know. I was wondering if Commissioner Egas was going to talk about the Salem Heights. And I know you're at council and testified.
Oh,
And I hadn't sent it out, and I thought maybe you would tell the commission about it.
thank you. I'd forgotten about it actually, because it was a while ago, but the Salem Heights Improvement Plan was adopted by the council unanimously to be included in the transportation system plan. And, you know, outside of the impact it has on my own neighborhood, I think the thing to note there was the process that was used and the way that the city and the neighbors work together to develop the plan and the degree of public participation we were able to achieve through that joint effort. And I think that's important because there are a lot of streets similar to Salem Heights in the city of Salem. And while I hope we maintain a higher priority than these other streets that come later, I do think it's a process for planning. And even though I may not live there by the time some of the improvements get made, but the process, I think, is an important one. Something that I hope the city looks to and applies in other places. If you find the neighbors with the right attitude, you find a staff person on city staff to work with them, the way we had Anthony Moore, the support that he got for the project. I think you can come up with plans that are variations from what might be the template wide that allows you to meet trade-offs that find trade-offs that best meet the communities, community support.
Susan? Any comments from the commissioners, side?
I'll defer to Commissioner Dolan here.
Are we under comments for the good order?
We are, right?
Okay, yes, we are now. Yes, I did know I missed something there.
No, I have a comment really good over. Something that came up a couple weeks ago that I actually kind of find some humor in, but I feel like it's something that we do need to have a serious conversation about, is I think there's some areas of the development code that we need to kind of take another look at in terms of, like, over time, we've had a lot of really great policies, a lot of really great intentions that have sort of like piled on each other and ended up kind of resulting in like a really convoluted set of standards sometimes. And this was really evident for me because one of my coworkers asked me, what are the setback requirements in the RM2 zone in Salem? And this is my response. Page long. And I'm just like, I'm gonna read this because I think it's become like, to me, it was just so funny and ridiculous at like how like all these very good intentioned standards end up creating something that's just impossible for the average person to understand. And so I'm gonna go through this, and this is what I tell a paraphrase that it depends, right? So the setback is 12 feet for 1 to 4 family buildings adjacent to a street, unless it's located along a collector or arterial street, in which case it's 20 feet. Multi-family buildings adjacent to a street is minimum 12 feet plus 1 feet per foot of building height over 12 feet, but not to exceed 12 feet in depth. The multi-family interior setback is subject to zone setbacks, so it varies depending on the zone of adjacent property. And if the multi-family building is subject to design review, the setback for the portions of the property abutting RS or RA zone lots are different depending on the number of housing units within the development. For developments with 5 to 12 dwelling units, the minimum setback for buildings less than 80 feet wide and less than 3 stories tall is 10 feet. For buildings over 2 stories tall and less than 80 feet wide, it's 20 feet. And the building is more than 80 feet wide and only 1 story tall, it's minimum 1 foot per foot of building height, in no case less than 14 feet, but if it's more than 80 feet wide and more than 2 stories, setbacks 1 feet per foot of building height, but in no case less than 20 feet. Multi-family developments with more than 12 units, setback for buildings abutting RAR's zone property is 1 foot per foot of building height, but in no case less than 14 feet, unless the building is 2 or more stories, in which case it's 1 foot per foot of building height, but in no case less than 20 feet, regardless of the width of the building. But a 5 foot reduction in the required setback is permitted if the fence between the building and the A or R's zone property is increased to 8 feet rather than 6 feet. For accessory structures, it depends on whether the building is, or the accessory structure is more or less than 4 feet height, in which it also depends on what the street classification is and whether or not it's accessory to single family or middle housing use. Accessory structures for 1 to 4 family uses have an interior front setback of 5 feet. There's no rear setback for accessory structures for 1 to 4 family uses unless it's adjacent to an alley, in which case the rear setback of 1 foot is required, or if the structure is greater than 9 feet, in which case it requires minimum rear setback of 1 foot per foot of building height over 9 feet. Side setback for accessory structures to 1 to 4 family developments is 5 feet, unless the structure has at least 1 wall, which is an integral part of the fence, in which case there's no required site. Accessory structures for use other than 1 to 4 family development are subject to zone interior setback unless the development is subject to design review, which may require additional setbacks. There are also requirements in some cases that buildings be placed exactly at the setback line. This is leading to getting into the setback requirements for the use area. Not to mention like the 100-foot setback for middle housing. So like I just wanted to bring that up. And that's why that's the rant that I prepared today. But this is just an example of one set of design standards for one zone. And I think that this is a thing that's come up in several instances where just I mean, this is job security for me, but also like it's a little ridiculous. And I wanted to maybe just take an opportunity to point that out, maybe as a more long range discussion in simplifying some of these development standards. I think could be a big priority for the city.
So next time I ask them, what are they building? So. There you go.
We kind of got a little.
Okay. Other comments for the good of the order?
I have just a couple here. The Energy Committee subcommittee has been meeting. We've had a couple meetings already that have been helpful. We decided kind of a scope of work for us to do. I think Shelby passed that around. I'm not sure, but we can send it around again. We have reached out to PGE and have asked them to do a presentation on what their plans are. We have not heard back. I think despite several very, very polite efforts to reach them. We'll move on to the less polite efforts to reach them. And hopefully we can have them here by the end of the year. I met with a couple of our Salem delegation to the state legislature to talk about the state of Salem's property portfolio here. And in the course of that, I also talked with the state sustainability director. There is a new legislation that was just signed that gives the state the authority to begin a process of examining their property portfolio and upgrading it. So there's a series of steps there But all new buildings will need to meet a new design standard as well as all buildings that do over $1 million in construction. Which of course is the bathroom these days, right? So anything that's new property will get that. And so they're gonna be doing a level 2 energy audit as well as some other work there and solar readiness assessment on their properties as they redevelop or as they move to new buildings. And so from our perspective, my goal would be that we try and raise up the Salem property portfolio towards the top since they have so much property here. The legislation also allowed DOTS to create a set of design standards. So they'll be able to talk about energy efficiency, solar readiness, everything from landscaping to tree coverage, tree canopy coverage on the property. So all of that will unfold over about the next 18 months. It will be up to the legislature to figure out how much they want to fund this in terms of how fast they can review their portfolio. But I think that's kind of an exciting opportunity for us as well. And I had an opportunity to talk with the folks at the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, and they are going to be hopefully doing some work with the city of Salem. We haven't quite figured out what the scope is, but we should have somewhere 40 to 60 hours of technical assistance from the National Renewable Energy Lab on our climate action plan. And I think maybe while we still have planning staff, I may come back and try and initiate some sort of mandatory use or replacement of heat pumps in the city of Salem. So I'll bring that back, I think maybe in September, and we can have that conversation. Right.
Any other comments for the good of the order? Thank you. So this is sort of echoing a lot of tonight's conversation around the importance of ensuring our climate friendly and equitable community in Salem to not only be in line with state requirements, but the intent behind those. And that related to buildings, I can't stress the importance of ensuring we have sustainable strategies, not only as a requirement, but really just from a fundamental understanding of the impact that buildings have on our carbon footprint. And as Heather outlined earlier very eloquently, I think it really showcases in the data how critical it is that we make moves today. And we do have strategies available to us. And as a design professional, we often have to rely on city staff and the review process and codes to encourage developers and our clients to implement those. They are available. They're often easily balanced as a life cycle opportunity with the building. And I think a lot of times it comes down to the idea of long hold buildings versus flipped buildings, and trying to encourage development in Salem that speaks to that long hold vision, so that we are building sustainably and we're building for the Salem future and not simply an immediate economic gain. So I just wanted to throw that out there as we're considering how to add even more review standards, but they are often used as a tool. And I know I personally have used them in discussions with clients that it is important, and this does offer an opportunity to create a better environment for the people of not only Salem, but the Willamette Valley in Oregon. Thank you. Any other Commissioner Eakins, did you have them?
Yes. I sat in for a while on the city council meeting the other night on the 400 some unit development, and having participated as a appellant in a previous case of Salem Heights, there were some things that struck me, some common issues that come up in the proceedings involving contested developments. One of them is around the conclusion of no reasonable alternatives, because often that's something that's brought up. And in this case, Commissioner or Counselor Varney from West Salem was on the basis of hers that she felt that there wasn't, there hadn't been as much of an in-depth analysis or look at the reasonable alternatives. And the other is that there's 63 conditions, which means that there's a lot of stuff now this has been approved that still has to go through an extensive process. But it's one in which is primarily centered on the staff and the public and the people that in the neighborhood who are concerned about it aren't really part of the process. And those are two things that I think the public doesn't necessarily understand very well. And from my point of view, I'm not really sure I understand how the no reasonable alternative fits in. I mean, I know legally fits in, but I'm not sure how those decisions are made or what that really means. And I'm wondering if at some point we just might get a briefing or a discussion about the use of that factor in the planning. It's not something immediate or anything, but it always seems to come up when you have an appeal. Well, then it comes up in the context of trees or city trees. In Salem Heights, for example, we had city trees taken out because it's a conclusion that there were no reasonable alternatives. But some of us felt it, well, there were. And the issue of no reasonable alternatives, and I don't know a lot of the specifics, but it came up the other night. And so I'm wondering if at some point in the future, we might just have a briefing on how that factors in, let's look at how those decisions are made. Because I think that's something that as the public participates in, and I know the staff makes changes and always tries to do design changes, but sometimes it ends up where there's some things that you don't want to happen and it happens anyway because decided that well there was no reasonable alternative. And I'm just not sure how that conclusion gets reached.
Yeah, I do want to clarify the code was changed with the tree code last year to say specifically what can be considered as a reasonable alternative. So it's pretty clear now, streets. It says what we mean by streets and stub streets, alignments, no TSB, et cetera, are required down the street. Utilities, topography, density. So it lays it out pretty clearly in the code, which is what we did last year to try to get around everyone disagreeing about it. Actually, an application in West Salem that didn't apply to them. They're asking for tree variance, so it didn't require reasonable alternatives analysis. It was about the economic viability of the property, which is confusing. Since people kept bringing up that term and saying they hadn't, Meyer Farm, some subdivision, they had to show that they couldn't move the street. There was no reasonable place to move the street except for but they were on a different application type. And also came in before the code was adopted. So we did try to do that in the code amendment last year to make it really clear what everyone's talking about. So I think it's a lot more clear. We're going to talk about the tree code again.
Well, I just use that as, it's an example. It usually involves, excuse me, it usually involves some belief that it could have designed it differently, or they could have avoided something, but that because it would affect the bottom line, they decided not to. I mean, I understand there's a lot of misunderstanding, and the staff looks at a lot of stuff in the public that complains about that doesn't, but I'm just thinking that that standard comes up a lot, seems to come up a lot, and it'd be good to know a little more in depth about how the staff looks at it and what the legal implications of that are. The other part I don't know how to address, I don't know how to address how you put conditions on things, particularly with what was addressed at the council, and I understand that is that some things that's, you get a preliminary plan, and that's all up front you're asking for is a preliminary plan, because if you ask for the details, then you're asking them to invest a lot of time. You're asking them to do a lot of specific planning, and might not be turned down, or might not go through with it. But at the same time, those are issues that are really important to the area, to the neighborhood, and it goes into a process that's obviously a necessity focused on staff and staff analysis that's pretty intricate. But at that point, the public's pretty much out of it. And that's to me another problem. I don't know how to solve it, and it's not a distrust of staff, it's just that once you get past that point, the public's pretty much had its say. I don't know if there's a way to address that or not, but that was just one of my.
It depends on the case too, because if it's a comprehensive plan request, then they have to go to, the neighborhood association, do a presentation. So I think there are ways that the city does engage the public in different stages.
Yeah, but let's just take this one for the example. 63 conditions. And it was approved. Or the appeal was denied. It was approved. But now the developer goes ahead and they go through the process and they try to meet those 63 conditions. And I have no doubt that staff is gonna hold them to that, but there is opportunities for variations. Granting variances to the conditions. There may be arguments over whether or not they've actually met the conditions. It's just that at that point, I mean, take the 63 conditions, and at that point, I don't know what the public has anything to say about it. And I don't know how to solve that problem, because I understand why it comes up.
Yeah.
It's just an observation.
Well, when you come
Yeah.
up with a solution, you should let me know.
I don't know, that's why I sort of, to me, there is a legal issue. And the only way I can think of exploring it is there at some point in that process where you can get public input or public feedback without delaying the process or unduly delaying, or and I don't think there's any appeal process after that. Unless you've raised an issue. So I don't know if there's any legal way to have a process in which the public can provide feedback, I'm not saying legal appeal or anything, but some feedback on whether or not those conditions are actually being met. And maybe it has to do with the variance or something. I don't know, Councilor Varney just simply asked for being maybe over asked, but wanted to be apprised of any variations and progress on that. And I've just noticed in the process is that once your appeal is denied and go on with those conditions, there's very little element of public participation. It's not a criticism of staff at all.
Just not
The staff is doing it, their due diligence in those conditions, but
I'll just say it's getting harder and harder for us to deny any application that's for housing under the state laws. It's getting more difficult for us to even have standards that we apply to it, so. The governor's bill, if you read in the paper, her housing bill that didn't pass, that died on the very last day. The latest version would require us to approve 10 adjustments for housing, just with no criteria, no ability to say no, so they get up to 10. There's a few things that would be protected, natural resource areas and some other things that they couldn't ask for. She's made it clear she's bringing that bill back. Tell you it started to say that we would approve any variance for anything, so the ordinance fees worked really hard to get that narrowed down. She's made it clear she's going to bring that bill back. The Oregon Housing Council that she appointed is working on many proposals. One that we reported the proposal is that for the next 10 years, no city can have a tree code that would protect a tree 60 inches in diameter or less. So completely wipe out our tree code for the next 10 years. That's their current recommendation that they're considering. They're considering that all housing will only be put to a hearings officer, the council and planning commission can't review it anymore. They're getting recommendations that say things like, if an engineer stamps a plan, it should get automatic approval, because the engineer's telling you it needs everything. The application on Monday night was stamped by an engineer. Some of the conditions were meet the setbacks. So I think this next session is going to be really wild, and you know, the state is more and more interested in just telling us what to do for housing and taking away housing crisis, right? And I think they have a long history of being able to demonstrate that cities have not permitted the amount of housing that our state needs, and so when you look at it from that perspective, not that interested in urban.
They can transfer payment of the taxes.
I think Commissioner Hill had a comment or a question.
Oh, I have a separate.
Okay, comments for the good of the order.
Topic. I'm on the subcommittee for natural resources, and I just wanted to thank Jennifer and Jeffrey for the great presentation.
Yeah.
Hard work they're doing. So
It was a great, both presentations are very informative.
yes.
Yeah. Other comments for the good of the order? And there's one more chance for public comment if you're just dying to come up to the podium. Okie doke. With that, we're adjourned.